Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's December 12th, 2024. And today we're excited to be covering a topic that we cover at least once every year, sometimes multiple times in a year. We're going to be talking about the status of religion in the United States, whether religion's in decline, whether it's on the rise, whether it's flatlining. And we hope to sprinkle in as much insight as we can muster from our professionals about the status of the rise and or decline of affiliation in the Mormon Church or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The book that we're covering today that I want to suggest that you all go out and buy immediately, and I get no kickback for saying that. The book is Goodbye Religion, The Causes and Consequences of Secularization. So we're going to take on the secular menace today in today's episode. And our guests are Ryan Cragun. Ryan has been on, Dr. Ryan Cragun. He's been on Mormon Stories several times now. He is a scholar focusing on religiosity and I'd say non-religiosity. He may say it differently. And accompanying him is Jesse M. Smith. And they've co-authored this book. And again, it's published by New York University Press, which I hear is better than Oxford University Press. But that's just what I hear through the grapevine. And I think you can purchase it on Amazon and probably directly as well. So without any further ado, Ryan Cragun, welcome back to Mormon Stories.
Thanks, John. Delighted to be here again.
Why have you been such a stranger?
I can only publish so much, John. I do my best.
No, it's great to have you back, Ryan. Ryan, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, just so that we know, all that you've done up to now? That's
sure
pertinent to what we're talking about.
Yeah, real quick, from Utah originally, grew up in Morgan County, Mountain Green is where I grew up. Went to the University of Utah, my bachelor's degrees in psych, went to the University of Cincinnati for my master's and PhD, and I've been at the University of Tampa since I graduated, so 2007. My two areas of research is kind of religion and you kind of mentioned it, but Mormonism and non-religion are really the kind of two foci. So I still do some stuff on Mormonism, not as much as I used to, but probably still about 30-40% of the work I do. And then 60 to 70% is on the non-religious, atheists, agnostics, secular groups, you name it, people leaving religion, all that kind of fun stuff. Yeah, and you can find me pretty easily online. Just Google me. I'm not the one who plays football for UCLA. There is another Ryan Cragun. That's not me.
And some of the books you've published already that we've covered in past episodes include?
We did Beyond Doubt, which came out in 2023. So we talked about that. We talked recently about an article I had on the percentage of the Utah population that's LDS. But I've also published on Could I Vote for a Mormon for President? That was a book with Rick Phillips, a book on international Mormonism. So that's another one. Geez, John, you're putting me on the spot. I'm not going to remember them all.
No, that's good. If you can't remember, I will feel bad for not remembering.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Ryan, it's great to have you. And joining us for the first time, as far as my memory goes, is Dr. Jesse Smith. Jesse, tell us about yourself.
Thanks, John. Delighted to be here. This is the first time I've been here. I don't know that we've met in person, actually. So I also am from Utah. I'm from a little town called Mapleton. It's not that little anymore. I went to Springville High. I did UVU. I'm now in Michigan. I went to graduate school in Colorado, at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And then I've been here in Michigan, Kalamazoo. There really is a Kalamazoo for a little over 10 years now. I graduated with a PhD in 2013, and I've been here since. And I study, I'm not as focused on Mormonism as Ryan has been. He's published an awful lot. I'm more of I do qualitative research, and I do some mixed methods stuff. I'm focused on secularity, non-religion, but I also do a lot on social deviance, self and identity. I'm sort of a sociological social psychologist. And so I kind of, I'm interested in collective behavior and those kinds of things. most of what I end up publishing does go into, journals that are religion area journals. So most of it is on, I would say, secularity. I've written on apostasy and deconversion and of course religious exiting with this book. So Ryan and I have a lot of shared interests. We've been working together for a number of years now. I don't know how long exactly.
Over a decade.
It's been more than a decade. So this is kind of the culmination of the work that we've been doing together for a little while.
And so when you, Rick, and Ryan hang out, who talks the most?
Probably Rick, but Rick's loads of fun, right? I mean, he's always cracking jokes and he's always got great insight. So we
tell Rick we miss him on Mormon Stories
for sure. Will do.
Yeah, he's fun. I agree with Rick on a few things that gets Ryan upset, and those are fun conversations.
I didn't know you supported Trump. That's interesting. No, okay, no, just kidding. Jesse, you also have a fun connection that our Mormon Stories audience will be interested in knowing. Do I have to pull it out of you, or you just want to?
No, I mean, I'm not sure I would describe it as fun. But it's weird. It's crazy. It sounds. It is very strange. Yeah. So, I actually worked for Chad Daybell. I know you've done episodes on Daybell and the Lori Vallow stuff previously. I worked for Chad Daybell as a grave digger. He was sexton at the Springville Cemetery, where his wife, first wife, is now buried. I actually spent some summers in that cemetery helping to dig graves for Chad. This was a long time ago. This is long before the insanity started.
Sounds like we're going to have to do another episode with you separately about.
We might.
And Ryan, I should tell you, 2024 is the first year I visited Mountain Green. That's where Pine Lake or Pineview Reservoir is, right?
It's right over. So Eden is where Pineview is, but it's right next to it. Yeah.
I drove through Mountain View to go to Pineview, and it was amazing.
Mountain Green. Mountain Green's beautiful. Yep.
I'm getting it all confused, but that lake out there is gorgeous. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Beautiful place. Love it.
All right. Okay. Well, let's jump in. Everyone's dying to know whether religion is got one foot in the grave in the United States, or whether it's going to rebound with the recent political machinations that are afoot. Maybe before we start, the thing that I would love an update on is the Pew Foundation's Rise of the Nuns study. I don't know if that's an okay place to begin. I know your book kind of talks about the several decade trend towards disaffiliation. Is that an okay place to start, or we can start wherever you want? Actually,
no, we can talk about the broad general trend. It's always useful to cover that.
All right, go for it.
So I like to give a number just to kind of make it clear to people what's going on. If you go back to 1990 in the US, about 7% of adults said they had no religious affiliation. That doubled by 2001, and today it's more than quadrupled. So we're somewhere around 30% of adults say they have no religious affiliation. That aligns with what Pew's saying. All the major surveys are putting it close to 30%. It hovers around in that range. So it's been a pretty dramatic increase. Now, the question is it going to keep going up? Is it going to level off? What's going to happen? There are other social scientists out there who think that this is the max and we're not going to get any higher. I think that's absurd and a bit crazy, but we can certainly talk about that and where we think the data are headed. But that's kind of the general kind of sense that, non-religion is growing, or at least has grown dramatically. And then the question is, what's going to happen next? And of course, what we're trying to address is why.
And so these are the nuns, NONES. And how is it that they self-identify? Just not affiliated? It doesn't necessarily mean agnostic or atheist, right?
Yeah, so we're only talking about one dimension of religiosity, which is just their affiliation. There's obviously beliefs and behaviors as well. We call that identity throughout the book, but that's just the one dimension. And these are people who say, they don't have a religious affiliation. Pew calls them the nothings in particular. I don't like that term. And they lump them in with people who identify as atheists and agnostics.
Okay.
Right, which can be problematic. But yes, it's mostly just this, checking the none of the above kind of on survey questionnaire. So that's where that comes from. And the leveling off is an interesting question. We actually address in the conclusion. We'll maybe leave this a little bit of a teaser toward the end, but we do make some very modest projections, I guess, in terms of where religious exiting is headed in the future in the U.S. But I do notice, some of those articles, John, you had us look at before this. There are people that are saying that it has basically leveled off. There are some indicators that might be the case, that it might not go much higher than 30, at least for the time being. But the question about whether it's going to, there's going to be another uptick again in the recent future, I think is kind of an open question.
Okay. All right. So we have some people joining us, and I'll share a comment or two. Definitely any super chats people want to share. Trevanon joins us from Europe. He's one of our most faithful and devoted viewers and listeners. And he's saying it's 58% non-religious in Europe. And that's kind of a way to just sort of check in when you say that some, Ryan, are saying it's going to cap at 30%. I'm sure Europe is what immediately comes to your mind. Do either of you want to talk about religiosity in Western Europe and other places that are as or more secular that give any suggestion that it could go higher than 30%?
Yeah, we can talk about that. I mean, my previous book, Beyond Doubt, was a global study of secularization. So just to mention a couple of countries, the UK is now more than 50% non-religious in terms of just affiliation. It gets complicated depending on the country. So you don't have quite that level in some of your Scandinavian countries. But then if you look at another dimension of religiosity, attendance, it's 2 to 4% of people are attending religious services on a regular basis. The reason why the percentage of non-affiliates isn't quite as high is because there was a long history of state churches. And to be like Nordic or to be Norwegian also meant to be a member of the national church. But that's changing, and now those numbers are kind of increasing in terms of disaffiliation there. But yeah, there are a lot of countries around the world. Australia is included, New Zealand, Japan. You kind of just pick the countries. Scotland today is majority non-religious. Hungary is, France is. There are a number of countries around the world where that's like, there are more and more people who are not religious in terms of just affiliation. Lots of research suggesting this. And then the question becomes, well, is that in the future for the US? I would be surprised if it wasn't. And we can talk about some of the indicators that would suggest this is going to go up probably pretty substantially over the next 20 to 30 years.
Got it. All right. Well, why don't we start off by you guys telling us why you decided to write this book, Goodbye Religion, The Causes and Consequences of Secularization?
I'll just say, I think Ryan approached me in 2018. Is that right? At a conference, and it basically kind of pitched the idea of the book. And I thought it was a great idea. We had both grown a little bit weary, I guess, of kind of the predominant narrative, certainly in our discipline, in our area, and in religious studies, right, about what the consequences of religious disaffiliation might be, right? Sort of everyone kind of has acknowledged the sharp rise of the nuns, and that non-religious are a real thing. It's a real force in American society. So people kind of acknowledge the demographic trends, but there's a lot of people assuming, this is scholars in the public alike, that this could be really bad for American society. What does it mean on questions of civic engagement and charitable contribution and those kinds of questions? So we thought this was really important in our area, our field specifically. Again, I mentioned those articles you had just sent us. There is kind of a narrative out there that this could be bad for society. So we wanted to dig into the data and be absolutely empirical about this, and just gather the numbers. And we did a whole bunch of interviews for this. And so we kind of wrote this with a little bit of the intent to kind of, question and counter that predominant narrative. And it's kind of everywhere, right? It's in the general public's mind, I think. And some scholars take that perspective too. So we wanted to see, how credible is this, and What can we do if we don't think this is quite accurate to kind of counter that narrative? So that was one of the main goals of the book.
Got it. Okay. I guess the next place I would think to go is to kind of talk about what changed in the 90s and why we started seeing a big change. Is there anything else y'all want to touch on before we jump there?
Yeah, we can jump into that. Sure.
Is it fair to say that the 90s in the US marked the beginning of a hockey stick sort of dynamic?
Yeah. So we talk about this right at the beginning. So right in the first chapter, we try and lay out what shifted. So if you look through the 1970s and 80s, the non-affiliates, the nuns, were hovering between 5 and 7%. And it didn't change for about 20 years. And then something clearly happened in 1990. There have been other scholars who have suggested that it was the alignment of conservative Christians with the Republican Party. Jesse and I tackled that argument in the book, and we don't agree. What we think happened is the end of the Cold War. There was something very specific that happened in 1989, 1990, and that was, the Cold War ends. Prior to that, and John, you're old enough to remember this, I'm assuming. Jesse and I both are. I don't know how many of your listeners are, but we lived through the tail end of the Cold War. For people who were alive during the Cold War, if you were to identify as an atheist during that time period, the immediate follow-up question was almost inevitably going to be, are you also a communist? And that's because the US had constructed the enemy during the Cold War as being the godless communists. So we were at war with atheists who were communists. That made it really hard to be open about your non-belief or disinterest in religion all the way up until the end of the Cold War. And then, of course, when the Cold War ends, we have a splitting in attitudes towards those two groups, right? So now, today, if somebody were to say, yeah, I'm an atheist, the odds are no one's then going to immediately say, well, are you also a communist, right? It just doesn't make any sense to ask that as a follow-up question. So it's become much more acceptable to admit that you're not religious. I might be speaking just for me here, maybe not Jesse, but I think there was actually a big pent-up demand to not be as religious as people were saying they were in survey data and other data, all the way through kind of the tail end of the Cold War. But it was once the Cold War ended that people were like, oh, now I can totally admit that I actually don't care about religion at all.
Got it. Anything you want to add to that, Jesse?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I just think the historical context changed in a way that kind of set the conditions, right, for the emergence of people to leave religion. Okay, it was less. I don't want to say there was no stigma, right, associated with leaving religion in the 1990s, but that really was kind of the beginning of it. So I think part of it was this new opening, a space for people that really weren't, religious very much in the first place. Now they can, say so without fear of being, stigmatized or discriminated against, linked up with, being a communist, et cetera. And then a lot of other things just sort of emerged too that we talk about in that first chapter about the role of the media, right, and just television shows and the opening up of these different kind of spaces, right, in which people can communicate and share ideas in a new way. Obviously, the role of social media, this comes later on, continues to facilitate, right, the right set of conditions for people to feel okay about leaving religion.
So if I'm just reflecting 100% anecdotally about what I observed, I guess I would say two things. Well, one is the rise of the internet, but clearly the internet didn't really start coming on until the late 90s, early 2000s. And so if this change indeed happened in the early 90s, then of course the internet wouldn't have affected that early part. I guess now that I think about it, I first opened Mozilla or Netscape browser, I think in 93. So that's kind of early. But anyway, the rise of the internet is something that I think about. The second thing is all the religious scandal of the 80s. So Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, Oral Roberts, Jerry Falwell. There was so much televangelist religious scandal in the 1980s. And then if you combine that with was his name Robbie Reed and the
moral majority
allying with Reagan. I guess that would have made sense to me So I guess if y'all want to speak to why you're not so psyched about, that theory that the alliance between, conservative politics and sort of corrupt televangelist religiosity, why you don't think that left a sour taste in the mouth of many Americans for religion. I'd love to hear why y'all aren't big fans of that.
Yeah. So that idea, the alignment between kind of conservative Christians and the Republican Party, was proposed by Houghton Fisher, who suggested that's what kind of drove it. And I don't know, and Jesse can speak to this, right? But maybe we're being too generous to people in the way that we're thinking about this, but I don't think we necessarily are. In our minds, if you're a devoutly religious individual, right, like you really, really care about religion matters a lot to you, but you're on the progressive side of the left-right continuum. So you're on the left side. If you were to find out, right, that, I don't know, maybe even your pastor, who's a bit more conservative than you are, is aligning themselves with the Republican Party, why would your immediate response be, oh, religion is getting aligned, at least some forms of religion is getting aligned with kind of conservative politics. I give up all religion, right? That just seems like a jump that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. So if we live in an environment, right, a religious marketplace where people can choose what religion they want and what religion they don't want. So if your religion that you are particularly, a fan of or raised in started to align itself with more conservative political views, why wouldn't you just join a different religion that has different political views? It doesn't make sense to just go, oh, all religion is bad, then I'm out, I give up, I'm done. It just seemed like a leap too far, right? A bridge too far. So that's really why we critique it in there. And we go pretty in depth and kind of wrestling with this idea and saying, no, it makes far more sense for somebody who's devoutly religious to go, oh, well, that's not my brand of religion anymore. I'm going to switch and go somewhere else. That would make a lot more sense to us than just like all the other stuff. Now, on the scandals issue, I think you're right. Scandals have been shown to lead people to not be as interested in religion. I think that's absolutely true. But again, like there are some religions that have far fewer scandals than others. So I think it's a bit complicated, but I think that's kind of a general summary. But Jesse, jump in and fill in details.
It is more complicated. It's not that Houghton Fisher are outright wrong about the role of the alignment of this alignment, right? It's just I think we write about this stated explicitly. They're just kind of missing the middle piece there, right? It might be the case that individuals turned off by the ultra conservatism or kind of fundamentalist views that they're not keen on. Ryan's right. They're not just going to flip a switch and I'm not religious anymore, right? They're going to seek out more progressive religions. And this will link up to kind of the conclusion that we make in the book, right? Once you're in a context in which there's more alignment, right, with the progressive religion and the wider secular values in the first place, those liberal religions tend to have less to offer, right, their members than conservative or higher demand religions do. Right. And so then there might be an increased, incentive or motivation to just leave religion altogether. So I think if we're going to put this in very simple terms, right, it's not just a 1-2 step. There's that middle step, right, where kind of more liberal versions of religion act as kind of the halfway house between, very conservative religions and then leaving religion altogether. So I think there's something to what they're saying. They're missing a pretty critical piece to that puzzle.
The term now, my grad school's coming back to me. Mediation or moderation. Are those terms applicable here?
Yeah, in effect, it would kind of be a mediation, right? That there's something happening in between, as Jesse said. So Houghton Fisher may not have been entirely wrong, right. But they, like Jesse said, they skipped a step, and maybe eventually that could have been the path that people are taking. Like that might be it, but we're just not entirely convinced that that's immediate. Like people's immediate response is, oh, yeah, the moral majority and Republicans are now one. I give up all religion. It just doesn't make any sense to us.
Yeah. Going back to this question of internet technology, I had my timeline messed up because long before there was the actual internet, I guess AOL launched in 1985. So this idea of dial-up bulletin boards and chat groups, there's at least a good 10 years preceding the official rollout of the internet, where people started talking about religions in, online, even if dial-up chat groups. So I have to think, and you talk about people that really learned, at least in the Mormon context, who started discussing Mormon church truth claims and learning about problems in Mormon history and truth claims in these AOL dial-up chat groups in the 80s. So I'm sure that y'all would agree that that's got to play some role. The rise of communication technology as a problem for religion. True?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just a light switch kind of thing, overnight sort of situation. Yeah, it was this. I mean, in historical terms, it happened in very short order, right? A lot can happen in a few years, but yes, right. It wasn't just about mass commercial use of the internet that suddenly instigated this. There was the antecedents, that came before that too. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I would add is we also see rates of disaffiliation going up in other countries much before they do in the US. So Canada is further along this path than we are. Same with the UK, same with Australia. And their rise in kind of the non-religious predates the internet, depending on which version we're talking about, right? So we're talking about like ARPANET that was started in the 1970s. I mean, I don't think that was really going to contribute to this, but AOL starting in 1985. Their rise of the non-religious actually starts in the 1960s. So yes, I think it contributes. I'm not questioning that at all. I think it definitely plays a role and maybe has accelerated the process, but I don't think we can say that that is the start of it, right?
Got it. Okay, cool. All right. So now that we kind of have some broader historical context, I guess, should we jump to the first main question your book wants to tackle, which is who's leaving? Should we go there, or do you want to go first?
I think that makes sense. Yeah, it's
All
a
right.
good logical.
Who's leaving?
Jesse, you want to start?
So we established 30% non-affiliation, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that, like, has it been 10 percentage points just over the past 10 years? Is that loosely right? Or
yeah, about that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's close. Why don't we have Ryan is more the demographer statistician here. I can give you the punchline, but why doesn't Ryan take the demographic question, and then maybe I can launch us into the push-pull stuff.
Why?
From that.
Yeah. So basically what we do in that chapter, right? We have a chapter literally called Who is Leaving, is we tackle questions primarily surrounding demographics. And we look to see, are men more likely to leave than are women? And we're actually looking over time as well. So we're using general social survey data. So we look at men, we look at race, gender, we look at race, we look at education, we look at income, we look at age, we look at a variety of different demographic components to see if this is just like a subset of the population that's actually increasing and they're exiting. We even look at region, right? So we look by region of the country. The short version of this is that everybody's leaving, right? So it's not that it's some specific demographic. The demographic information really doesn't do a great job predicting who's going to leave. At the very end of that chapter, we put together a mixed effects model. This is like complicated statistical stuff. But at the end of the day, basically, we're able to explain about 13% of the variation in who's going to leave using demographic information and period effects combined. Which is, I mean, a lot of people will be like, that's amazing. You're explaining 13%. We like to flip that around and say, actually, we're not explaining 87% of the variation in who's going to leave. And for us, that strikes us as like a pretty big problem. One last piece here that's worth noting. If we go back to the beginning of the General Social Survey in the 1970s, there were bigger differences in the demographic data. So yeah, men were more likely to leave than women. Today, that's largely not the case. White individuals were slightly more likely to leave than Black individuals. Today, That's still the case, but the gap has shrunk. Same for age, same for education. On all of these measures, if we go back 40, 50 years, there were bigger gaps, but they're shrinking. And that's basically because the non-religious look like the rest of the population today. There are not meaningful demographic differences between the non-religious and others. If we look just at atheists, yes, those differences are bigger. But for the non-religious, those gaps are basically negligible today. There are not huge differences.
Yeah, and the differences that there were not as big as many people think, right? Scholars have made a lot of hay of this in our area too. Sociologists have talked a lot about, it is young, white, middle class and affluent, highly educated men that are leaving religion, right? It's almost just become a trope now, a stereotype that people kind of take for granted. Even scholars who should know better, right, that are looking at the data will still kind of, that's who's leaving religion. And as Ryan just suggested, right, it's not that there's nothing explanatory there, right? We can explain about 13% when we add up all of these different variables, but again, 87%, that's a pretty big percentage of things left unexplained, right? So it's, those demographic characteristics are really not a very good predictor anymore, right? They used to be better, but not that much better, right? And now that's even less the case. We just everyone from every demographic, from every area of the country, every age group is leaving.
And let's do our best, since this is Mormon Stories, to kind of check in on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with each kind of point. So can either of you speak, just kind of going back a tiny bit, with this rise of the nuns and disaffiliation, how's the Mormon Church doing with losing its members, as far as you know, relative to other comparable churches or religious groups?
That's a great question. I'm going to let Ryan take that. I'll just mention, I went back and listened to the podcast you guys did. It's been a little while now on this question. So I'm really interested to hear what Ryan has to say about this. He looks at these numbers more closely than I do.
Yeah. So, obviously the LDS Church's numbers are a black box. We've talked about this many times. They don't share a lot of information. And of course, what they do share these days is just like, hey, we're growing, right? What they never really tell people is like what percentage of those people actually still identify as members of the LDS Church, what percentage of those people actually attend. And we know that they actually have that information. We know they do, but they don't report that. So they're literally just saying like, hey, this year we added this many people, whether it was through conversion or children who are being baptized. So they're constantly reporting like, we're growing. Though if you look, their growth rate, even according to them, is much lower than it has historically been. And then, of course, they're kind of hiding, if you will. I don't know. I mean, it's probably intentional, but they're hiding how many of those people are actually disaffiliating, are leaving. We actually know, like, Utah is not immune to this. So I hate to use Utah as a proxy for the LDS Church, but we don't always have really good data on the LDS Church specifically. Utah is not immune to this growth of the non-religious. They're growing. The non-religious are growing in Utah just as fast as they are anywhere else. I would be astonished if somebody were to make the claim that somehow Mormons are immune to this. There's no reason to think that that's the case. These trends are applicable to every single religion that we looked at. And in fact, we did this in the book. We looked to see if rates of exiting were higher by different religious groups. They're not radically different, right? They hover from like 10% up to 30%. But the LDS Church is basically right in the middle. There's no evidence to suggest that they're immune to this pattern of religious disaffiliation. All the data that we see suggests that it's hitting them just as much as it's hitting anybody else.
In fact, I was looking at one of the charts talking about geography or region. Mm-hmm. So this is on page 51. And it just, I don't know if this is just random or what, but the mountain region between 2010 and 2021 had the highest percentage of exiters by region, if I read it right.
Yep.
22.8%. Now, of course, I don't want, because a lot of my listeners might tend to fall in that category. And those are kind of have been the heydays of Mormon Stories. I have to think, I wonder if a very active, and it's actually very well known that like the ex-Mormon subreddit is the largest ex-religious subreddit. There are more ex-Mormon YouTubers and podcasters than anywhere. But of course, I'm applying some of my own background and experience and bias into this. Is there anything to make of that mountain region having the highest percentage, or am I missing something?
No, I think it's fair. Jesse, did you want to jump in?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, those numbers are what they are. We don't parse things out in terms of looking at specific religious groups there, do we? I don't think we do right
No, we
there,
don't.
right? So we don't have specific information about Mormonism. But yeah, the broad strokes here are that the trends are occurring just across the board, not just across demographic characteristics, race, class, gender, region, etc., but across many different religious groups, right? Whether they're, mainstream, churches with many members to more, high demand and smaller groups, right? People are leaving just across the board. And it used to be the case that region had some explanatory power there. It used, most people thought of, well, it's the Northwest, right, and it's the Northeast, right? That's where your exiters and your apostates come from. It's just not the case anymore. It's really from everywhere, and that the Mountain West included, and that therefore must include, right, part of the heart of the Mormon.
I must be reading it wrong, because the South, East South Central is 10.5, West South Central is 12.1, South Atlantic is 13.4, but then you jump up to the mountain, it's 22.8, almost double the South generally, and then the Pacific, which is California, just barely trails behind at 22.4. It seems to me like along with New England, New England's actually behind the Mountain West and the Pacific. It seems like the Mountain West and the Pacific lead by a significant amount other regions, if I'm reading that right.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do with that table is illustrate that the growth of the non-religious has hit every region, right? So clearly there are still regional differences, but the growth has hit every region. As far as regional differences go, I mean, it's tricky because I don't know that we have like definitive data and definitive kind of evidence to suggest exactly what's driving it in every region. We do know that Washington State, right? So if you look at PRRI's data that goes state level, Washington State's now more than 50% non-religious, which is the highest of any state. So New England's still pretty high, but then you hit the mountain region, right? And those numbers are a little weird because they're aggregated by decade. We're doing that just to kind of wipe out year-to-year fluctuations. So in most of those states now, it's closer to 30% instead of the 22. But the mountain region has always had this kind of element of like, it's tricky, like being Western, right? Being independent. And we think that that's probably part of what's contributing to this. So it's not necessarily that they're more metropolitan, which was what you might get in like a New York City or even a Seattle or a Los Angeles. They're actually just more independent and libertarian, and they don't like being affiliated with organizations. So that might be part of what's contributing to the higher rates in the Intermountain West. Is actually that it's not that like everybody in Salt Lake or Boise, right, or something like that is leaving because they're metropolitan. It's just actually a lot of libertarians who don't like being told what to do.
Yeah. Just to kind of close out this demographic point, I'll just reflect on my own anecdotal experience, because I do spend a lot of time with these populations, at least over the past 20 years. It did occur to me when I did a mixed faith marriage retreat relatively recently that it was exactly split 50%, to what degree the wives were the ones who didn't believe versus the husbands were the ones who didn't believe. And that really shocked me. It dispelled for me 5 to 10 years ago my perception that Mormon men were more likely to leave first than women. I don't think that's also my experience. And I think I've heard that young Mormon women are as likely or even potentially more likely to leave the Mormon church than young Mormon men. So it's not just young Mormon men that are leaving. I I will say I would ask y'all again if there is something to age, because it is my experience that the younger you are in the Mormon context, the more you're likely to leave. And I recently was given an insider statistic. I don't know if you ever caught this, Ryan. I was told by a well-placed source that something like 60% of Mormon return missionaries are inactive or stop attending church within something like 6 months of returning home from their missions. Again, these are secondhand numbers that I'm not claiming are hard official, but there seems to be something about the younger cohorts bailing in droves.
Yeah.
I mean,
go ahead, Jesse.
I just want to say that, just going back to the gender question, we do tackle this, and I think it's absolutely applicable to the Mormon context as well, right? It has been the case in the numbers that bear this out that men, tend to be more likely to leave overall. This might be a function of they have less sort of to lose in some sense. So we had this conversation, kind of a lengthy conversation about the role of stigma and its management, and we focus mostly on minority groups, right? But I think in general, right, especially white men, middle class men, they're going to have greater flexibility there, right? They may not be facing a great deal of stigma or discrimination in other facets of their life due to their status characteristics. So it's less of a big deal for them to leave, right? To exit religion and even claim a non-religious identity or some affirmatively secular identity. All right. But given the sort of the cultural expectations associated with, women versus men, females might have something more to lose. There might be more reason, right, to stay than to leave, even if, right, intellectually, cognitively, in terms of their belief, they are, of course, not, any less likely. They're not necessarily more believing, right? There just might be more of a social cost associated with leaving explicitly, that's different across men and women.
Yeah, and I would add, John, you were hitting at this, the cohort or generation thing. In this book, and actually in my other book, Beyond Doubt, we talk about it as a mechanism of secularization. That the transmission of religion from parents to kids is one of the mechanisms where secularization actually takes place. I hate to kind of use it as like an analogy, but like transmitting data through lines, right? So like power lines or things like that, you always have some degradation of the signal. That definitely happens in the transmission of religion from parents to kids. So as parents are trying to transmit, like, this is what we believe, this is what we value, we see that that's really one of the spots where the failure to transmit actually happens, right? And so it is, in a sense, kind of one of the mechanisms. So we know that younger people are dramatically more likely to be non-religious. The current numbers, right? So if we're using all of US adults, it's like 30%. If you look at the youngest cohorts, it's closer to 50% have no religious affiliation. So definitely there are cohort effects. There's no question about cohort effects. What we don't argue is that it's an age effect, right? So it's not that as people age, they get less religious or more religious. It's literally the cohorts. It's a weird distinction to make, right? But among social scientists, we try and separate out age, period, and cohort effects. There are definitely period effects. So post 1990 is when the rise took place. There are definitely cohort effects. Age effects are a little bit harder to see in the data. So I think that's why we're trying to make that distinction.
Okay. Go ahead, Jesse.
Well, I'll just say this is very interesting in the context of some of those articles that you just sent us, John, about how Mormon youth aren't going anywhere, right? And that there's actually this resurgence of interest among the young.
And you know what, Jesse, since you brought it up, if it's okay, let me go ahead and just read. Let our viewers and listeners know what we're talking about, because they may not know. So what I did is I shared with these guys a few articles, and I'll put a couple on the screen just so that our viewers and listeners can know what we're talking about. So it seems like the Mormon Church doesn't like this narrative that people are leaving religions and specifically Mormonism. So, here's an article by the Deseret News, which is, I don't know if it's too calloused or brazen to call it a propaganda arm of the Mormon Church, but it is owned by the Mormon Church, and it does seem like a lot of their articles are written by Tad Walsh or Jacob Hess or Stephen Cranny, which are kind of well-known journalists / apologists. But for example, this article I sent them is Perspective Latter-day Saints aren't going anywhere. Look at the numbers. I mean, that just seems ridiculous to me on face value. I'll pull up a couple articles, but just quickly, Ryan or Jesse, what about that headline? Latter-day Saints aren't going anywhere. Look at the numbers. Whoa.
Go ahead, Ryan.
All must be well. All must be well in Zion is what I'm getting from that article. All is well.
Oh, I think that's very intentional, right? They're trying to make the point that all must be well in Zion. And to be fair to them, they have that 56% of the state of Utah is still LDS. That was before my article came out last year showing that it's actually 42% of the state, right? So I don't know if they're actually going to adjust that or if they're going to continue to go off of the church's numbers, but like we know those numbers are inaccurate. It's hard to fault people who are members of the religion who want to believe that their religion is true, looking for, the silver lining in anything that they can find. And I'm just not at all convinced, right? So the one bit of credibility that I would give to them is that for those who are staying, right, so who are still members of the religion or any religion for that matter, I think it is actually fair. I increasingly I've taken to calling them the remnant, right? They want to find people who affirm their identity and their values. So they may be growing somewhat more orthodox and religious because that's where their faith and values get affirmed. So for those who are staying, it may be the case that they're a little bit more engaged than they were 20 years ago. But that doesn't mean everybody's staying, right? The numbers are pretty compelling that the vast majority of young people are just not interested in religion anymore. And part of that is something that we're going to talk about in the next chapter, right? Value misalignment. We'll get into that. But I'm not convinced by these numbers that like, oh yeah, no young people in the LDS church are leaving. Come on, that's trash. That's absolutely ridiculous. There is no evidence to support that.
There's
it's sort of consistent with our we talk about this, I think, in the introduction, Ryan, where we set up this framework, right, of why religious leaders explain why people are leaving and why those who have left kind of explain why they're leaving. And this is very much on the side of you want to create the right impression, right, an impression of success, and people are staying, and they're not really leaving, right? We can talk about this a little bit later too, because this, on the flip side, those that have left are also, constructing a narrative about, how and why they've left that paints them in a positive light. The problem is with the religions, not them, right? In this case, this is the problem is with, people that leave, not the religion. There was some line in there about, this is any person that leaves this is cause for sorrow, I think was the word that was used, right? So that's a problem, and it's not with the religion, the organization. It's with the person who has left. We have a kind of a lengthy conversation about that in the book.
Yeah, I mean, again, anecdotally, I have active Mormon bishops, active Mormon stake presidents, Mormon missionaries serving missions that are constantly reaching out to me, telling me that they no longer believe, but are stuck as missionaries or stuck as bishops or whatever. And that's not even taking into consideration the fact that stakes and wards seem to be closing at a very accelerated rate along the Wasatch Front. Every month, it seems like, if you go to Mormon Shrivel, that Mormon Shrivel Reddit subreddit, just this month, like 3 stakes closed in Kearns. Now there may be some population shifts going on where people are moving out of Salt Lake County and into Utah County, because I think Utah County is growing. But there's no way I'm ever going to believe that the Mormon Church isn't falling prey, just because, again, my podcast grew by like 40% last year, and half of my listeners and viewers have never been LDS, but the other half have been. And then here's another article that the Deseret News came out with just this week enrollment growth at Latter-day Saint universities rebuts narrative about young adults losing faith. And what I tend to want to think is going on there is they're playing with this online university they have, and just the way that they count, signing up, and whether they force high schoolers to sign up as being enrolled in CES programs, that I hate to say this because I don't want to sound pernicious or negative. It seems like the Mormon Church sometimes wants to manufacture statistics to rebut the reality of certain narratives. And this article seems to be contrived intentionally. And again, this is by Tad Walsh, who is known to literally be an apologist journalist for the Deseret News. I'm not asking y'all to comment on that, but keep going, y'all. Anything else y'all want to say about this?
Yeah, so I really dug into this one. I work at a university, right? And given some of my current other responsibilities, I'm the president of my faculty senate. I'm very aware of how enrollment works. It's not that hard to change your enrollment numbers by just reducing your standards. So you can always accept more people, right? I'm just assuming they get more applicants than they actually have spaces. And so in any given year, you could just say, well, we're going to not be as stringent in our enrollment criteria. And suddenly, boom, you've got an uptick in enrollment. My university, just to give a sense, like the University of Tampa, and I don't know if Jesse knows his numbers for Western Michigan, but we get something like 50,000 applications and we accept about 2,500 students. So we actually accept more than that. We enroll about 2,500 students, but we accept like 10,000, something like that. So they're talking about like BYU, Idaho, right? And the numbers have gone up. Well, sure. If you're just accepting more students because you dropped your criteria, like that's a pretty easy way to bump your enrollment. And then to turn around and be like, see, people are really interested in our universities. I'm like, oh, come on, right? Like you're playing, like this is just a shell game. The other thing that they do mention in there, as though it's a good thing, and I'm actually, I don't know how closely Jesse read the article, but I'm interested in his take and yours as well. They're piloting, not necessarily there, right, but in their Ensign College, which is mostly online. We can talk about online education in a second. They're piloting 3-year bachelor's degrees. And somehow they got this approved by the accrediting body, which I'm kind of appalled by. But basically, they're saying you can get a bachelor's degree in 3 years. They dropped the number of credit hours that are required from 120 down to 90. And they're cutting out all electives and minimizing the gen ed. They're like doing all sorts of super sketchy stuff. Effectively, they're offering worse degrees and probably for not as qualified individuals. And then they're turning around and saying, see, this illustrates that they're not losing their faith. I'm not convinced for even a second that that's actually what's going on.
Well, and I'll just add, I did read the article closely. Just even the numbers aside, one of the things I didn't like, or that I think is a cause for confusion, is the assumption that, you're either in institutional religion or you have no spiritual life whatsoever. So they conflate a bunch of things, right? They conflate a practice, right, in a specific institution, in this case, in the Mormon Church, and faith and just spirituality in general, right? So that if a person, is disinterested or grows disinterested in the Mormon Church, that they've lost any sense of wanting to cultivate a spiritual life in any way. So that was a distinction, or rather a lack of a distinction, that bothered me, setting aside all the problems with the way that the numbers are being manipulated here.
Yeah. And they also talk a lot about online education. They're enrolling tons of people. But if you pay close attention to that article, they don't talk about retention or graduation rates, which, all the big rating companies that do this, Newsweek or whatever, they care a lot more about retention and graduation rates than they do about enrollment. So they're not telling us how many people are enrolling. They are telling us how many are enrolling. They're not telling us how many are graduating or retaining from year to year. I think those numbers actually matter a lot more. So yeah, that story sounded like propaganda to me, to be honest.
So what I've done and what I'm doing right now is I'm just asking, we've got 409 people joining us on this live stream, and I'm just going to do like a spot poll, and I'm asking everybody just to send a comment right now as they look around whatever geographical region they're in, what they're seeing in terms of wards and stakes being created, not being created or destroyed, or being destroyed. And I'll just share what I'm seeing. So Daisy May writes, a ward in my San Antonio stake was closed in August 2024. That's just a couple months ago. Richard writes, the average ward has approximately 125 members, and he's estimating that puts the LDS Church at 20% activity rates worldwide. That's what I've heard as well. About 20% of the members that the LDS Church claims worldwide are actually attending. Let's see. There are a couple other people that shared. Randoms writes, stakes and wards are getting smaller here in the UK. I hear in Scotland the church is almost completely dead. And then Rebecca in another state, well known for its LDS representation, Rebecca Sirine writes, wards and stakes are falling like flies in Arizona. So Arizona sounds to be following a similar pattern as they are here in Salt Lake County. So I'll share other people's comments as they also have something to share. I'll just say here, this is outside of the U.S., but Cruel's right. The average ward in Southeast Brazil has approximately 90 to 100 active members and a weekly attendance of 80. And that's a ward, not a stake. I mean, I think that's pretty important to note. Any quick reactions before we move on, Jesse and Ryan?
Those numbers are astonishing. I mean, an active ward of 90 to 100 people. I was a missionary in Costa Rica, right? 96 to 98. I don't know if we could have pulled off a ward with that many people. That would have been a big branch, maybe. How are you going to staff everything like that? Those numbers are pretty shocking. So it sounds like they're doing the best they can to shuffle the deck chairs around on the Titanic as though that's going to save things. Looks pretty bad.
Well, and I again, just drawing this out more broadly, I think this is illustrative of what's going on, not just with the Mormon Church, but with religions in general. I think in 2022, there was something like, 7,500 or 8,000 congregations that closed down. I think maybe 30 or 3,000 or maybe 3,500 that that opened. So we're talking, significant net loss of religious congregations across the country. So I mean, this is certainly consistent with that broader trend.
Just really quickly, a couple more I'll share, and then we'll move on. Renee Nolan writes, we lost 2 wards just a few weeks ago here in Logan, Utah. I would say Cache Valley, where Logan is a stronghold for Mormonism, along with like Rexburg, Idaho, and Utah County. So to see wards shrinking in Logan, and that's where I was excommunicated. So I lived 12 years in North Logan. So that's interesting. Again, from the UK, religion dying in UK, not just among Mormons. And I don't think anybody here is claiming that this is just a Mormon problem. I think we're saying the opposite. And then Lou Smith writes, I was up north of Seattle a couple months ago, drove by a church building at 11 a.m. on a Sunday, 7 cars in total were in the parking lot. So I'm not going to pretend we're doing a random blind scientific study here, but I think anecdotal isn't worthless. Pioneer Videos is saying Denver YSA wards just combined where he is. Okay, I think we've made the point. All right, so let's go ahead and move now. Jesse, was it you that was going to talk about the push-pull analysis you did in the book and what you're finding in terms of what's pushing people out and what's pulling people out?
Yeah, I'm going to start, and Ryan can fill some things in here. So this is really it's an important part of the book. In some ways, it's the main theoretical contribution that we make. So yes, it's push and pull factors. So what we're doing is borrowing from, the field of demography, migration studies. Scholars will talk about the things that are, pushing people out of, specific countries, things like war and poverty and lack of, economic opportunities and those kinds of things, while simultaneously wanting to understand what is pulling people toward, a new target countries, right? So this is what migration scholars do. They just look at the the flows, right? The global flows of populations across, international borders and such. And it struck us that this is a pretty good analog for talking about religion and religious exiting, right? There are a number of factors that are pushing people out of religion, but it's not just that, right? There are some things that are pulling people toward, more secular lives, right? So we identify a bunch of them. We talk about morality and doctrines and hypocrisy, and we give lots of examples of the push factors, and we center this mostly on interview data. And there's some really interesting stories of the reasons that people give for why they left. Some of them are things you would expect, right? Some of them are just kind of those cognitive intellectual things, just disbelieving in particular religious claims, right? They couldn't accept some of the statements, the claims, the doctrines, the dogmas of their religion. And as those questions built up and they weren't satisfactorily answered, right, that's something that's going to push people out. We talk about, again, morality and different social and political issues, where people stand on issues like abortion and LGBTQ issues and those kinds of things. And it's not that difficult to see, right, how those act as push factors. And there's been, there's a pretty robust literature on deconversion and other things that we borrow from that demonstrates this pretty clearly, right? Hypocrisy was an interesting one, something that we expected, but it was much more prominent than we expected it to be, honestly, when we were analyzing this sort of thematically. So, John, you mentioned earlier, about religious scandals and different traumas that people have faced, right? Seeing religious leaders and other people in the pews doing things that directly contradict the preachings of the religion and its teachings, etc. But people also just sort of growing tired of their own hypocrisy. We had some former Catholics talking about doing confession and not liking their own hypocrisy, knowing that they're going to again at some point do the things that they're in confession for in the first place. And these can often be rather small trivial things that don't align perfectly with the doctrines that they inherited, usually as children. And that's something that is grating and wears on them. So the combination of these things, Ryan, and I'm missing a few because we talk about a bunch of them, political issues as well. These are things that are just, pushing people out, and something that they will reflect on. Obviously, our interviews are retrospective accounts of people explaining why they have left. And there's other data that backs this up. Pew's got some information that basically, gives you a pie chart that breaks this all up, the reasons people give for leaving religion. And I think it was framed as religious teachings as being a big one. It's like almost 40%. So that plays a big role. And we made a big deal of it because a lot of scholars in the field will tend to minimize that, right? It's not really so much about, specific beliefs or doctrines. They'll kind of downplay that and talk more about, social networks and other things going on. So we spent some time there talking about that. Ryan, you want to say something about the simultaneous pull factors, though, too? Because I think that gives a nice sense of what's actually going on.
Yeah. So it's not just that people are being pushed out, right? That's clearly a big factor, but there's a great deal of appeal to a secular life, if we want to use that term. One of the biggest ones is that people just have better things to do with their time. So rather than spending Sundays or whichever your holy day is in church or doing different religious activities, people want to go hiking. They want to go to the movies. They want to go shopping. They want to go out to eat. And we'll talk more about how non-religious people actually use their time later, but they definitely have better things to do. They like the autonomy that they get in developing their own worldview, their beliefs, their values, the things that they care about, their ethics, and being able to think for themselves. They love having a modern worldview. They don't like trying to defend things that can't be defended when we're thinking about like modern technology, modern science, and all of these things. So they love that. And then we talked about generational change as well, but we steal something from Rick Phillips. So this is our second shout out to Rick Phillips on this one. But he proposed this a while ago. He's never written about it. I asked him if we could include it. And it's this idea that once you leave religion and if you become non-religious, now you're only playing offense. You don't have to play any defense. So if we think about like people debating religion, if you've got two religious people who are fighting over some religious principle, both of them may have a sword so they can attack, but they also have to have a shield because they've got to defend. Because anybody who's affiliated with a religion is going to have things that they have to defend, whether it's supernatural belief claims, whether it's, sexual abuse scandals, whatever it is. So they've got to attack and defend. But if you're not religious, you don't actually have anything that you have to defend. So you can actually go into the battle with two swords and you're just attacking, because really, what do you have to defend? And then there's a great deal of appeal to that like, you don't have to defend the Mormon church, right? When it does something that you're like, oh, wow, they have $100 billion and they're using it to build temples or whatever, right? There's no defending that. You just get to attack. So there are push factors pushing people out. There are pull factors. There's a great deal of appeal. And as Jesse mentioned, that pull factor piece is kind of novel in what we're doing, because a lot of times people, even the Deseret News, they describe people leaving as like, this is a terrible thing. This is bad. Their lives are going to be awful. And it turns out they're not. And we'll come back to this towards the end when we talk about our metaphor, but it's really the combination of those two factors.
Yeah. So I'm, obviously in the work that I've been doing over the past couple decades, the first thing I noticed was, the awareness of problematic Mormon church history, and with the internet accelerating, people's becoming aware that Joseph Smith married 14-year-olds and acted like indistinguishable from a sexual predator, the racist stuff, the historicity problems of the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. A lot of it started as truth claim stuff, but then very quickly the LGBT stuff, Prop 8 and the Mormon Church's opposition to same-sex marriage became a real big problem from people. The ordained women movement with women feeling like they're second-class citizens. These kind of social issues became big. And then I think as we talked about before, not to put my thumb on any side of the political scale, but as Mormon wards became increasingly vocal in terms of conservatism, sort of the MAGA mentality, Trump conservatism, my sense has been that a lot of more liberal or progressively political Mormons just started feeling like the church wasn't for them. I think that COVID affected a lot of people. I also think that not just because they stopped going to church and realized how fun brunch or pajamas or hikes could be, but also they just realized their lives didn't get worse when they stopped going to church. Sometimes they even got better. But then you add to that the mask debates where some wards, especially in Utah and Arizona and Idaho, there was open rebellion against being forced to wear masks by maybe, let's just say, politically conservative Mormons that made more, I don't know, politically liberal Mormons just feel like this is crazy town. I'm checking out. And then I'd say the rise of the internet has been highly influential, and just the more people who that are gay, the more supportive you are that are gay, the more people that who leave religion, the more likely it is you get infected with the virus of questioning and or leaving your religion too. So this is just me freeform mentioning the dynamics that I see. Sounds like there's decent overlap between what I'm seeing and what you guys are mentioning, along with support systems now within ex-Mormonism specifically, whether it's Thrive or ex-Mormon Reddit or the podcast communities or Facebook or Instagram. It's less scary now to leave, and people are more likely to find friends and sort of that temporary community that then allows people to become informed, find friends in community, and then feel safe to leave. Anything y'all want to say in reaction to that diatribe monologue?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it is a complex interplay of things, and that's what we try to show with both the push and pull factor stuff. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot happening. I think you're right to point out to the support thing, right? Things have changed dramatically in the last few decades in terms of the kinds of networks and social support systems that people can find available to them once they have left religion. We spent, and we can circle back to this if we want. And in another chapter, we talk about, social networks and the kinds of activities people find themselves doing after they've left religion. We talk about joiners versus non-joiners. That is, people who end up, joining often temporarily. It's kind of a transient thing, joining secular groups, right? That function sort of as support systems, right? From ex-religious support systems in some ways. And these groups, proliferated in recent decades. There's a lot of them. So I think it's really key to highlight the importance of just the context of the kinds of support groups that people now have available to them that just did not exist in previous decades. That's a huge piece.
Anything you want to add, Ryan?
No, I think what you described fits perfectly in the push and pull framework, right? There are factors pushing people out. There are factors pulling people out. It's that combination. And for any individual, it's going to be distinct, right? Any individual is going to be unique. And that's why I think this framework's actually really helpful, is we're not trying to say this is uniform for everybody, right? It's some individuals, it's going to be this, others, it's going to be that, but it's the combination of factors that's actually contributing here.
Yeah. And, and we might come back to this too, but the question about, we also have this other typology that we use throughout the book. So not to layer too much on here, but we talk about, religious indifference, this liminal phase, and then secular activism and kind of everything in between, right? So most religious exiters, I'm speaking not just context of Mormonism, but just nationally and with all religions, right? They sort of just slowly drift out of religion, right? It's not a dramatic break with religion. It's not some, trauma story. People just sort of slowly drift away and become indifferent, right? They're not joining, humanist groups or anything like that. They just kind of, they slowly drift out. And then you've got on the other end of this, you do have people that, come from high demand religions and have a hard break and, need a secular support system of some kind. So they do join those kinds of groups, and it's everything in between as well. So there's a lot of factors at play here.
It's one of the fun things about doing a live stream is you can kind of check in and get more feedback. So I'm gonna just share some of the comments that we're getting because I think it's interesting. So there are still more people sharing kind of what the status is of the church growing or shrinking where they live. So I'll just share a couple things. Let's see. I don't think I already shared this. David Johnson writes, I'm in Idaho Falls. Did I already share this one?
Nope.
I'm in Idaho Falls, Idaho. That's again another bastion of Mormonism, southern Idaho. I'm pretty sure Idaho Falls is southern Idaho. He says, have received word that my former stake is redoing the wards and are now putting 4 wards per building. The wards are small. They are shuffling to fake growth. Okay, that's David Johnson's perspective. Lisa writes, my home stake just rearranged, slashed one ward, made a branch a ward, and renamed my home ward. She's saying this is in Southwest Virginia. Richard writes, my local stake in San Diego just closed. For those who don't know, a stake is like 10 Mormon congregations. It's a larger, it's like a region to a city or an area to a city kind of thing. And then people are starting to talk about leaving. Trevanon, he's never Mormon, but he follows Mormon stories closer than almost anybody. He mentions that a lot of Mormons, ex-Mormons, mention what they call second Saturdays, which is just loving their Sundays and getting another free day to enjoy their week. And a 10% raise is another thing ex-Mormons often reference, not having to pay tithing. Any comments? Y'all feel free to jump in at any point.
That's a pull factor.
All fits. Yeah, it's definitely a pull factor, right?
Pull factor.
Yeah.
Okay. Connie Mae Rasmussen Allen writes, I once stayed in my pajamas all day long on a Sunday and didn't feel guilty. And when I'll just say that when I first was kicked out of Mormonism, kicked out of the Mormon church, I was like feeling that I was missing stuff and everyone else was missing stuff. So I started creating these secular congregations, much like Sunday Assembly or Oasis. I think your book mentions Sunday Assembly at some point. And, people would come originally, but then I just found like it's hard to compete with brunch. It's hard to compete with Sunday brunch, with Sunday hikes. And eventually I realized maybe I shouldn't try. Maybe sitting around in pajamas watching a cool Netflix rerun is actually just as healing or as edifying as some people's Sunday experience. Or at least that's what people are naturally choosing. I'm fine. And we'll talk about this next. I'm not finding that ex-Mormons are dying to replace their Sunday experience with something in any way similar. Before we jump back into that, though, I'll share a couple more comments people are making. Bewitched writes, I believe in science and in a 44.5 billion year old earth. That's obviously your book mentions adopting kind of that valuing of science or secular worldview is definitely associated with leaving. Kate Hampstead writes, the internet has been great for supporting autonomy, so many belief systems to explore. Richard writes, they went out of their way to destroy community and made church boring AF. That's an interesting observation. I grew up in the days where the Mormon church was doing Boy Scouting, which they've gotten rid of. They were doing road shows and dance festivals and youth conferences and potlucks. And it seems like at some point in the 90s, the Mormon general authorities just started saying, oh, everyone's too busy. We need to cut back and simplify church. And many feel like they've kind of weakened or thinned out what was most interesting or connecting about the Mormon cultural experience. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that.
Yeah, we talk a little bit about this in the book. I don't think we do it at length, but there is regularly, and we'll come back to this when we get to chapter 6 in particular, but there's always this concern about like the loss of community when people leave, that if religions break down, will people be more likely to be lonely? Will people be distraught and not have friends and connections and all of these concerns? We don't think it's actually that big of a deal, but at some level, I certainly recognize the appeal of having a close-knit community and having a supportive social network. I think those are actually really, really important things for society. Now, does that mean that we all have to be members of churches or church replacements like an Oasis or a Sunday Assembly or a Thrive or something like that? I don't think that's necessarily how you replace the community. So it's going to be probably a transitionary period as we're moving away from organized religion and to something else, that people are going to have to figure out where they're going to find community, because community does matter. I think it's important. And we talk about that in the book, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be replacing it as a one-to-one, but we just do it in like supernatural Sunday assembly or non-supernatural Sunday assemblies where people get together and have a church-like experience without all the dogma. I don't think that that's necessarily the right answer.
Yeah, I mean, community is obviously very important, but it comes in many, many forms. And it's interesting, John, to the last comment that used the word boring there. We kind of make a bit of a big deal of this in the book, the fact that it was honestly kind of a boring story, right? Most of the people that left, and actually got this in the interviews when I'd ask people, well, what do you do now with your time? What have you lost or whatever? And most of them look at me a little bit, askance and say like, what do you mean? I go on living my life, right? I do all the things that I enjoy doing anyway. I've maybe got a little bit more time to do those things. They spend more time with family. They're playing board games with family on Sunday instead of doing church. They're doing all of these normal, sort of just, conventional, boring kinds of things, right? The story isn't really much more dramatic than that. Now we can talk about, and we will, about, I want to downplay the fact that, people leaving can experience, a lot of turmoil in their lives. And one of the good things about the book is we track this over, we take kind of a life course approach to this, right? So we're asking people about, their life histories, honestly, right? And any kind of, turmoil or personal upheaval or trauma, right, tends to be bracketed, right? It tends to be something that is, transient. They kind of, they might do a little something like the Sunday Assembly or Oasis for a little while, and then they just kind of, phase out of it and they continue to live their normal lives. So it's not a very sexy story. It's kind of boring, but that's what the data suggest.
All right. Well, that's fantastic. Let's go ahead and jump to the next part of your book. And I guess the next questions that kind of come up are, where are they going? So are they, and this is one of the questions I get the most, at least in terms of the Mormon context. It seems like most ex-Mormons do not join another church or another religious tradition. And in my experience, over half of ex-Mormons end up identifying as either atheist or agnostic, much to the consternation of my Christian listeners that really feel angry and upset that ex-Mormons more often than not tend to jettison both God and Jesus. And they often want to know why. Why is it that ex-Mormons all of a sudden become allergic, not just to church, but to God and Jesus too? So where are people broadly in the U.S. going when they leave religions? And we could talk about location-wise, but also beliefs and community as well.
You want to start us there, Ryan?
Oh, I was going to have you start. Yeah.
You want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I actually find that a really interesting question. And I don't know that we have, if anyone knows about data on this, it would be Ryan on Mormonism specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it the case that, such a large percentage, right? They're not doing religious switching much, right? Many people from, any number of mainline, for instance, Christian religious groups they'll switch religions, right? We just talked about how some might go from, more conservative to more progressive or liberal kinds of religions that better fit, their values, etc. Why is it that there's more of this, people just, jettison sort of all of it coming from Mormonism? It may have something to do with the nature of the religious group itself, right? So-called high demand or high cost religions versus those that are, much more of a mainstream. And there's a thing in sociology called open systems theory that looks at, churches at the one end that are in a state of kind of equilibrium with the broader secular society, right? Versus those that are in a protest kind of state, right? And these are sects and cults and new religious movements, et cetera. And so I think that it does have something to do with the nature of the religious socialization that the person experiences, especially in their childhood, right? And so you might expect from higher demand religions a kind of a more complete break with organized religion in, just fully. And that might lead many more than from other more liberal groups to jettison the idea of a God, right? I don't know. I don't know what Ryan's got to
I can
add
jump in. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you under there, Jesse. Like I'm happy to take that. I thought you were going to talk about the chapter more broadly on where do they go. But I think there's a pretty clear answer here. Most Mormons are taught that there is one true church, and there's a lot of criticism of other religions. So if the one true church is not true, why would any of the others be true? Right? It's kind of setting them up, right? So the religion itself sets them up for this idea of like, well, if this isn't the truth, why would I look at any of the others? Now, that's not to say that they don't go explore, but you also have to recognize that like Mormonism is built on a foundation of other religions, right? So it draws heavily on Christianity writ large, right? So maybe Catholicism if you want, but like Christianity writ large. So obviously, you could pick off Mormonism and say like, well, okay, Mormonism doesn't work. That's a problem, but maybe the foundations are solid. And so if you dig a little deeper, but it doesn't take long. And this actually is where I think I would agree pretty strongly with what John has been saying, that the internet and modern kind of technology and sensibility and like media has made it very easy to find other scholars who have critiqued lots of other religions. One name that comes to mind is Bart Ehrman and all of his research on the Bible, right? So if you leave the LDS Church, it's like, wow, they've got historicity issues, their doctrinal issues don't make a lot of sense, there are all sorts of these problems. What about just like Christianity generally? And then you pick up a Bart Ehrman book and you're like, wow, I had no idea. Why would you continue to believe? So I think it's kind of like Jesse was saying, built into the religion itself that it makes it really hard once you leave to try and find something else that you're going to find credible.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the religion has already undermined that. And there's actually data going back to the 1980s by Albrecht, Barr, and Heaton showing that Mormons are dramatically more likely to become non-religious when they leave than a lot of other religious groups.
Mm-hmm.
But
I wonder how much of a percentage there is left for those that do take the track that many others leaving more liberal religions do, the spiritual but not religious, more of these like liminal nuns kinds of things. I don't have data on that. I don't know that. We certainly don't discuss that in the book. I don't know if you know, Ryan. I mean, what's the other half?
Data on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
But just to be clear, I don't get a sense that people leaving religions outside of Mormonism are flocking to new churches either, correct?
They're not. No. Mormons are more likely to give up all religion, but that's like 1980s data. Today, I mean, we talk a little bit about this, but we don't have really compelling data on like where everybody goes when they leave, in part because we're not focused on switchers, right? So we don't talk about people who have switched religions at all. There are some people who have talked about that. Darren Sherkat, in his book on the changing religious landscape, he points out that about 40 to 45% of Americans switch religions during their lifetime. So quite a few do. We don't spend a lot of time on just the switching, right? We're only looking at the people who are leaving religion altogether. So that's really not the focus in this book. But certainly there are people who switch. And there's a long history of research on looking at switching. People who leave a religion and then join another, they generally tend to join a religion that's fairly similar to the one that they left, but it's going to shift for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's political, maybe it's geographic, maybe it's family related. So there is switching that still happens. That wasn't the focus of our book.
And switching really is about switching institutions, right? So it's affiliation with an organized religion. So that doesn't capture even this, whatever the subset is of the nuns, right, who aren't institutionally affiliated in any way, but continue to embrace even sometimes, traditional religious beliefs and claims, right? So there are theists, obviously, among the nuns, right? There's, I mentioned spiritual, not religious. So this is just on that one primary question about, identity, about affiliation, right? Do you have a religious affiliation or not? So there's obviously a world out there that, people are not involved in any way in organized religion, but they're doing other things that reflect other components of religion in terms of their beliefs and their behaviors.
Yeah. To give a fun number that maybe your listeners will find interesting. I was writing a book chapter about 2 weeks ago, and I was trying to illustrate how the different dimensions of religiosity don't necessarily align. 6% of the atheists in the US attend religious services on a weekly basis. So just because you've left or you don't identify as religious doesn't mean that you've given up all of your beliefs, things like that. Yeah, people are strange, right? They're not logically consistent. We shouldn't assume that they are.
And it's really interesting too. Just we show a lot of charts. This book is very data heavy, and one of the things that I'd like to dive into at some future date is just we do these 3 comparison groups throughout: those that have religious exiters, those who have stayed or joined a religion, and those who are never religious. And sizable, we show that the kinds of differences between these groups on a variety of questions, and most of them make sense, but there's still fairly sizable chunks of religious exiters who give assent to claims about hell, right? They believe in a literal hell and those things, and even biblical teachings, and taking the Bible literally. There are non-trivial numbers of religious exiters that still adhere to and embrace those claims. Now, there's a variety of things that might mean, right? I think it could be fairly complicated. We don't address that directly in the book, but some readers might be kind of surprised, like, oh, these religious exiters here, they still do this and they still think this. It's pretty fascinating.
So let me. This is gonna bleed over into a couple of your final chapters, because you talk about everybody's fear that, number one, society's going to unravel, or that it's going to be bad for the humanity if people leave religion. But let me just ask kind of a direct question that's really been on my mind. We've seen over the past, let's just say 5 to 10 years, a really dramatic spike in mental illness. I don't think I'm making that up. I think I've seen the New York Times do several pieces on that. Broad spikes in anxiety, depression, suicidality, and mental illness. It's hard for me not to then make an association that if I know that religion's on decline, that that maybe the decline of religion is in part contributing to isolation and loneliness. We've got that bowling alone idea, that people, that the active ingredient in wellness is is community. Sorry, that the active ingredient in religious wellness is community, and that if that's the case, then when people start losing their religious communities, they become isolated, they start feeling alone, and then of course you're going to see depression and anxiety and even suicidality spike. So so your book talks about secular groups and being able to find biking groups and hiking groups and knitting groups or whatever. Where are people leaving religion finding community? If they are, is it meaningful community? And do you show any discrepancies in wellness between people who have left religion and people who stay? And do you have any reason to believe that this sharp decline or the sharp increase in societal mental illness in the United States is in part attributable to the decline of religion?
I want to hear Ryan on this, but I'll just say up front that this is a complex problem. There's a lot happening here, and I don't doubt that religion will play some role here. But I think there's many other aspects of society and the culture at large that feed this problem of isolation and loneliness. I think technology and social media and everyone being on their phones all the time plays, it's kind of hard to overstate the role that plays. I don't mean to downplay the religion side. So there are many different sources, I think, contributing to this problem. As to the question about, about our data, right? And especially we did 120 interviews. We tried to broadly represent people from different kinds of groups, or those that I mentioned earlier that become religiously indifferent, right? They had kind of minimal religious socialization early on, and then they slowly drifted away. All of those, all the way to those that came from fundamentalist religious groups, like think Jesus camp sort of stuff, right? We had, I think, 25% that came from more fundamentalist groups from our sample, and they're finding community in other ways. Some of those communities we mentioned earlier about those explicit secular groups, but for the most part, most religious exiters are not joining up, secular or humanist or free thought groups, right? They're finding communities in other ways, and that again might be online communities. It might be the hiking group or whatever, or just spending more time with family. Loneliness, I think, is a problem, and I don't doubt that it's on the increase. I'm not convinced that religion is as an important feature of this as maybe some people are. We can come back to this when we talk about civic engagement and charitable work and that kind of thing too. But that's all I'll say about that. Ryan, what do you have on the loneliness question? I want you to speak specifically about the stuff that we say on mental health and well-being and physical health and well-being, about the role of religion there.
So we do tackle this in chapter 6, and I've written about this elsewhere. I was just pulling up a book chapter I wrote somewhere else. It's a different book. That chapter is called, and people can find it on my website, right? I make them available for free. This chapter is called Religiosity and Happiness, Much Ado About Nothing. I was invited to write a chapter for a book on religion and happiness, and they wanted me to write about non-religion and happiness. And I think what the editor was hoping is that I would be like, oh yeah, non-religious people aren't as happy. What I did instead is I used a big international survey that had data from lots of countries, over 50 countries, and I examined them individually, so in each separate country, to see if there was a statistically significant relationship between three different dimensions of religiosity. So we've got our identity, we've got behavior, we've got belief, and how happy people are. So this is getting at some level like the mental health. I know happiness is not a perfect correlate of this, but capturing this happiness relationship between religiosity and happiness. And so this is co-authored with a colleague, David Speed at the University of New Brunswick. We went country by country and examined this. And what we find is that the US, out of the 50 countries that we looked at, is the only country where there is a consistent relationship between religiosity and happiness. The only other country, it depends on the variables that we're using, right? But like we're in the same boat as Turkey and a couple of other countries. But, and what I want to point out, like this is the really important part here, even when there is a statistically significant relationship, that's only the first step whenever you do statistical analyses. The second step is to determine how big it is, or the effect size, and how meaningful that relationship is. So yeah, we did find that there's a relationship between how frequently people attend religious services and how happy they are. But the effect size is so small that it is literally negligible. It isn't anywhere close to reaching clinical significance. And it was only true in the US and a handful of other countries out of the 55 countries that we looked at. So anybody can grab that book chapter and read it. But basically what it's saying is, even when there is a relationship between religiosity and happiness, it's negligible. It's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. So I'm not necessarily directly addressing the like mental health broadly speaking, but if we're using happiness as a proxy for that, the data are pretty clear. Now, if you look at a lot of the research, there's an entire journal called the Journal of Religion and Health. I look at it a lot. I read it because I do publish on health stuff. Almost all of the research that finds relationships between religiosity and health, whether it's physical or mental health, almost all of that research is using either really weird samples, right? So like older Black women in rural Alabama, or I don't know, Chinese immigrants to Mexico or something. Like they use really obscure samples and then they find a statistically significant relationship and they ignore the effect sizes. There's nothing here. There's no meaningful relationship between religiosity and mental health. It just doesn't exist. When you do find it, there's no meaningful effect size. So yeah, on this issue, am I concerned that people leaving religion might lose community and this could contribute to that? Like it's possible, but right now there's no evidence that non-religious people are any less happy than anybody else. There's no evidence that they're any less physically healthy than anybody else. The data just do not support this at any level. And anybody who's telling you that, they're full of shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on your podcast, John, but like, it's just not true. There's no compelling evidence to support this.
Right, though there, and that's right, except for the fact that there are these, and we discussed this in the book, indirect effects, right? So on the question of physical health in particular, right? If a religion has prohibitions against unhealthy behaviors like alcohol consumption and smoking and illicit drug use, etc., right? Well, then yes, you might find that those that adhere to that religious group will have better physical health outcomes as a result of that, right? But that's mediated just by the idea. So the responsibility that the religion can take for that, right, is through doctrines about abstaining from particular, substances, whatever, right? But it's not religion per se, right? Anybody, right? An agnostic person who doesn't drink or smoke. Ryan and I, neither of us drink, right? We go to these conferences and everyone's, having drinks. We're like, have a drink with us. And we're like, we're boring. We don't drink, right? We're accruing the same physical health, benefits from, not, and I'm not dissing on drinking, right? People can drink moderately and be fine physically, but I'm just saying, any effect that you might draw between the two is always mediated by these, it is indirect, right? It's not the religion per se. It's just the personal choice about whether or not to, consume, alcohol, drugs, et cetera, that might have a detrimental effect on one's physical health. And I think that stands, I think, is sort of an analog for the mental health question is too, going back to the piece about, community, the importance of community and finding meaning in that.
Yeah, I mean, to talk to that, if you have social support, regardless of the context, you're going to get all the same benefits as if you have social support in a religious context. So it's not that religion gives you community, right? It's community gives you community. You can find it in a religious context. You can find it in a different context. I do want to mention one other thing real quick. There was a fairly well-known book that came out more than a decade ago called American Grace by Putnam and Campbell. And John, you mentioned the bowling alone thing. That's what made me think of it. In that book, they make all sorts of claims about how unhealthy and like problematic non-religion is. But what a lot of people don't realize is they cook the books in terms of how they set up their sample. So what they did is they took people who had no religious affiliation, they put them in a group, and then they took all of the people who had a religious affiliation but never attended religious services, and they put them in the same group as those who have no religious affiliation. And so they're comparing those people to the active, devout, religious, frequently attending religious individuals. And that's how they do all their comparisons. And so they're trying to make this claim of like, oh, look at all these non-religious people. They're not healthy. They don't contribute. They don't do all of these things. But look at these devoutly religious people who go to church all the time and they're like super engaged and they're civically engaged. They're great. But all these non-religious people, but they're conflating who is actually non-religious. And then you walk away from that book and you're like, wow, if people leave religion, the world's going to go to hell. Like this is going to be really bad. Turns out they've conflated a whole bunch of things and cooked the books in a way that is really not fair to the non-religious in any meaningful way.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a compelling case. This is just a question you would ask any academic. Like, would it be unfair to say that y'all are doing me-search in the sense that you have your own points of view on religiosity versus secularization, and that folks could challenge? I know this is like a third rail, but like challenge your objectivity because you clearly, at least you, Ryan, are kind of known to be an advocate for secular ways of life. I know the answers, but I'm going to ask the question anyway.
Well, I'll just say to start.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah,
you're right. Ryan is more, public about this, and he studies some of these things that I don't focus on as much, especially on the Mormonism question. All research is me search in some sense, right? I mean, we pursue our intellectual interests, our research interests are driven by the things that we care about and that we experience. I don't think that's in any sense, I don't think that undermines, I don't think that's a discredit, right, to, the person doing the research. On the objectivity question, though, that is something that we were very keen to maintain throughout this process. And one of the things that helped us do that, right, is that we weren't talking about, I don't think we mentioned anything about our own experience in this, right? And we're going broad, we're going national, we're talking about, religion in general. And, there's ways in which we, try to throw in the appropriate caveats. When we talk about autonomy, for instance, as being one of those pull factors that we mentioned in chapter 3, we talk about how, if we both have one child, right? And, we actually got this question in the Author Meets Critics session where we were presenting on the book and defending it. Well, what if your child ended up joining a church or wanted to join, the Mormon church? And we both kind of, shrugged and just said, well, yeah, I mean, that's fine. We consider that a success of allowing autonomy to our children, right? We're not socializing them or indoctrinating them into any particular belief system, right? If as a thinking adult, my son wanted to join the Mormon church or any other church, I would absolutely, right, support that. I would engage him. I would argue with him. I would answer questions. But that's, if that's a value, if autonomy is a value, and it is, right, I wouldn't have, a problem with that necessarily. So we do remain, I think, again, you can't be value free in doing any study. We don't claim to do that. Nobody can do that. It's not possible, really. but I do think that I think we're measured, and we write as, I think, an objective piece of scholarship here, just really following the data, following the numbers, following the things that our participants are saying. That I might agree with a few things that some of my interviewees are saying. I don't see that as being a problem with the research itself.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I agree with everything Jesse said, and I'll just add two things real quick. So one, the qualitative data, right? It's interviews. We can't really share that for confidentiality reasons. The quantitative data is all publicly available, right? So anybody who has questions about how we did the analysis or the data that we used, you can replicate all of it. And to illustrate that, right? We actually put all of the code that I used in R, we put it up on OSF. So anybody, the Open Science Foundation, so you can actually post your code. Anybody could take our code and evaluate it and see if we did it right. As I like to tell people, I may not be religious anymore. There are a few things, but there's one thing in particular that I hold to be sacred, and that's data. You don't mess with the data. The data are the data. And anybody can evaluate how we did this. We've had a number of leading experts in the sociology of religion evaluate our book. They didn't challenge any of the factual claims that we're making, any of the analysis. They haven't challenged any of those things. So yeah, you could say sure, at some level we actually agree with some of the findings. Okay, that's fine. I think Jesse and I won't speak for Jesse. I probably would have been more excited if at the very end of the book, I could say secular people are happier, they're healthier, they're more moral, they're amazing, right? Maybe that would have been great. We don't say any of those things at the back of the book, at the end of the book. We basically just present the data, and the data suggests that there aren't meaningful differences here. So people can challenge our objectivity, but you can't really challenge the data, and you can't challenge our analyses unless you can show that we actually did it wrong.
And it sounds like you would welcome any challenges to the data.
100%. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. And I will mention, our latest review was Catholic Books review, I think, Ryan. That was
it was a theologian.
Surprisingly a very glowing review from a Catholic theologian. And by the way, I'll mention too. Can I mention this, Ryan? I'm not sure. I won't identify.
Well, I don't know. We're live. Mention it.
But one of the scholars, a well-respected scholar that reviewed the book for us, is not a non-religious person. And this individual was quite pleased with the product and thought that it was an excellent piece of scholarship. So it wasn't just non-religious people, supporting other non-religious people. We've really engaged with others, including evangelical Christians and Catholic theologians. Beautiful.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a chunk so far of what we wanted to talk about. I do think one of the things that I really loved, I found it to be kind of a golden nugget at the end of the book, was you made a list of 10, help me out here, of 10
propositions.
Yeah. And weirdly, because I was jumping around, I found proposition 9 first, and then I tried to go back and hunt for the other 8. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I hope they listed all the propositions in one place. And lo and behold, you did on page 265. The one that caught my eye was proposition 9. Well, why don't you talk about what the propositions are, and then talk about the ones you want to highlight today, and then we'll talk about number 9. Yeah, Ryan, why don't you start with the propositions? And I don't want to make sure that we at least briefly touch on some of the, speaking of lists, the list of concerns too, which we've only alluded to. Do you want to go first? You want to go there first, Jesse, or no? Let's do the propositions.
So one of the things that we're trying to do with this book is formalize theory. So the book, we're hoping that anybody could read it. Anybody with a reasonably good education would read it and definitely understand it. But as scientists, we care a lot about theory. So there is a lot of theorizing going on. So there's obviously the push-pull stuff, but we also put forward testable well, propositions are not directly testable, but propositions that can then lead to hypotheses that are directly testable. And so we put forward 10 of these, I think. Is it 10 ultimately that we come up with?
Yeah.
Nine propositions.
For the
Sorry.
propositions.
Yeah.
So 9.
So we have 9 propositions. And the idea is that as we lay these out, we have clear justifications for why we've got these propositions. But what they do is we're supporting them with our data, but they allow other researchers to say, okay, well, that's the proposition that Cragun and Smith made in their book. Let me take my data and test it. So they turn the proposition into a testable hypothesis to see if we're right or wrong. This is how science is supposed to move forward, right? People make propositions, they put forward a theoretical framework, and then everybody can test it. And as we just mentioned, right, like we're totally open to somebody coming back and saying, well, I looked at your propositions and you're wrong, right? I don't find this compelling. So I think it's useful to have those propositions laid out the way they are. And I'm happy to kind of mention them. I know you wanted to talk about number 9, John, but generally they're talking about like different ways that it would like increase the odds that somebody would leave religion. And so we have 9 of those that we go through. Is there some that you wanted to talk about in particular, John?
Well, I guess I could start with the one that caught my eye. You wrote, well, I'll just read a couple. So you have, I love the term cateris paribus. It means all things remaining the same, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Proposition 1 is individuals who hold more modern egalitarian views will be more likely to leave religion than those who hold more traditional views. And several of those early propositions, it almost reminds me of Jonathan Haidt's Righteous Mind, that depending on what you value, is likely to kind of reflect your religion and your politics, depending on what you value more or less. So you talk about having progressive social and political values, which makes you more likely to is associated with leaving. I'll try and say that more carefully. If you elect religious doctrines and teachings, you're more likely to leave. That almost seemed axiomatic, because I don't even know if I'm using the right word there, but that's fair. Proposition 4 is societies modernize people who find, people who are more secular. As society modernizes, people are likely to become more secular. Those are some of the ones. People who value autonomy are more likely to leave. People who value science and the natural world are more likely to leave. I hope I'm not slaughtering this.
It's okay.
People who value logic and reason. We don't mean to be insulting to believers, but correlation does not mean causation, right?
Right.
Greater exposure to modernity is associated with leaving. And then the one that caught my eye was, the larger the proportion of someone's social network is that is non-religious, the higher the odds they will leave religion. And for me, I thought about what I call the Mormon bubble, which is the Mormon church for so long has encouraged you, really, maybe even unintentionally, just encouraged your core close friends and social groups to be Mormon, which is going to protect, in theory, LDS church members from the sort of disaffection that other religious traditions might have, that might be more likely to associate with non-religious or non-Mormon people. Anyway, that's an overview. What do y'all want to say? Anything in addition? I thought that was cool.
Well, just coming back actually to something you alluded to. Yeah. With those propositions, we are, some of them might sound a little, flippant or condescending, and that is absolutely not what we are doing there, right? Those that value reason and logic, right, will more likely leave. One thing that I want to mention is we're not establishing causality there, right? And there are obviously people who value reason and logic and maintain, a particular religious faith, right? So this is not speaking to the notion of intelligence or anything like that, right? These are literally just formalized expressions that arose from the data itself, right? Having looked at the themes and the data itself, these are kind of the propositions that track from this. And the reason that we did this is not to list off all the great things about leaving a religion. It's so, as Ryan suggested, other scholars can go out and test this and disconfirm it, right? We can be wrong about some of these propositions. It's an academic book, right? And it's data heavy. I don't want to dissuade anyone from buying the book. I think it's eminently readable too, and I think that way people will also find value in the book. But on the going back to the bias question, right? This was evaluated by other researchers and other scholars. And so I just want to give a sense for the reason that we did those propositions. It's like so that they can be tested by other scholars and show us where we're wrong.
Yeah. Want to jump in on the social network stuff. So we actually don't do as much on social networks as probably we would like to. It's the main reason is it's hard to get data that have social network information that includes religiosity. So that's actually really, really challenging. Would I love to spend more time on that? Absolutely. I think it's really important. But I'm also, or we're also drawing on a paper that I did with some colleagues using computer simulations, which is another way of kind of testing some of these hypotheses. But the basic premise is like, if you are surrounded by people who all have the same, so you're religious and you're surrounded by people who are also religious, kind of what John was saying with like the Mormon bubble, right? It's actually really hard to leave in that context. But as you start to add, we call it like the self is the ego and then alters, right? So others, as you add alters who don't share your beliefs, if most of them still do, you can just be like, oh, well, I disagree with them. That's fine. It's not a big deal. But once you're kind of surrounded by people who all have different worldviews, what we actually found in the computer simulations is it didn't necessarily make people like atheists. It just made them more accepting of all worldviews and less exclusive in their own. So you'd find people that it's like, oh, I have a Jewish friend, a Muslim friend, a Hindu friend, a Buddhist friend, and I'm Catholic or something like that. When all of your friends have different beliefs, it becomes really hard to then turn around and it's like, well, you're going to hell and you're going to hell and you're going to hell. Actually, they're your friends. So it's like, well, maybe they're fine. And my conception that like, if you don't agree with me, you're not going to go to the right place. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe anybody can really go to the right, to the afterlife if you're religious. So that's kind of the basis for this. And then of course, if your entire social network shifts to where you're the only one who's not religious, it's going to be really hard to maintain that. So social networks actually do matter quite a bit for this. And we need better data on social networks to be able to make stronger arguments about this.
Love it. Really quickly, would y'all even be able to come up with let's just say there's people here who are listening. Half our audience has never been Mormon now, but almost all of us have felt frustrated or challenged in our religious experiences. And many have either left or are thinking about leaving. Based on all of your research, do y'all have suggestions on how to leave religion, or at least leave religious orthodoxy, with as much healing and growth and happiness and joy as is possible, versus things not to do, things to avoid? Or is that not your department? I know I'm the one that has the PhD in clinical and counseling psychology. So
yeah, I was going to say you're the clinician. For my own experience, mine was mostly taking refuge and support in academics, as boring as that sounds, right? Most of mine was just diving into these questions. I find them really, really fascinating, right? Back to the research is me search kind of question, right? This is kind of what my own exit experience is, what drove a lot of my research interests and helped culminate in this book here. So I'm not sure that I have specific recommendations, clinical recommendations, although I do need to think about this a little bit. Ryan and I are writing a chapter right now called The Nuns and Duns. And it's for a book about, I don't remember the title exactly. If you do, Ryan, the clinical, it's basically like, kind of a handbook for clinicians about how to deal with, non-religious and secular clients and people who have left religion. And that's not really our wheelhouse. We have another author, Bethany Gohl, who's writing on the clinical part. I have some generic and kind of obvious things that, I might say, but my experience was not one of finding specific, social support groups. I was really kind of did this lone wolf kind of thing. And then I, went to grad school and I met other academics and I met Ryan. And so my outlet, my support system has largely been in the academy and just in my own my own reading and thinking and the enrichment I get from learning more about this. I don't know if that's not probably going to translate very well into specific clinical recommendations. I don't know. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And as Jesse said, neither of us are clinicians. John probably is the better expert to talk about this. But I've had lots of conversations, some with extended family who have left. And because I'm a very public figure, like they've reached out to me. A couple of like initial things that I would say is one, your safety is priority. Right. So always make sure that whatever is happening, you're going to be safe. Right. So just like physically safe, I think that matters quite a bit. The second piece is I'd say come up with a plan. Right. So where is it you want to end up? Think about it that way. Think very carefully about what it is you're trying to accomplish, where you want to end up, and then think through the best way to get there. And then the last two things that I would suggest, I've actually given this advice to religious people who are not Orthodox, right? Including a bunch of Mormons, who, again, a lot of family members, but friends who are like, I don't believe everything, but I kind of want to stay for family reasons or whatever. And I would say, use the religion. Don't let the religion use you. I think that's actually a useful way to think about it, that there are things that you can get out of the religion instead of just giving to the religion all the time. So as you're working your way out, you can do the same thing. And the last thing I would say is, there are a lot of these support groups now. There are plenty of support groups. I would probably reach out to one of those and find one that's going to be supportive of your transition as you're working your way out. I think we still need a lot of those support groups. They're hard to maintain. You need good leadership to maintain those. And part of the reason why they're hard to maintain is a lot of people I think Jesse mentioned this earlier, they kind of swing through these groups, right? As they're making their exit, it's hard. They need to work through their issues. They need supportive people. They need somebody to listen to them. And so they'll do that, and then they'll work through their issues. And once they've kind of worked it out of their system and a lot of the anger and anxiety and frustration is gone, then they kind of leave the support group, right? And they move on with their lives, and they just become normal, everyday, indifferent people who aren't worried about religion. So I don't know that that's like, I'm not a clinician. Don't take any of this as clinical advice, but like from the many, like thousands of people I've talked to about leaving religion, those would be like the broad level suggestions that I would make. I don't know, John, tell me how bad that was clinically.
Before John, just let me jump in there, because I think that's great, Ryan. That's a really good way of outlining those things. On the first thing, on the safety thing, in case that sounds hyperbolic, right? Mm-hmm. We didn't really get to our interviewees, our participants, but there were people that talked to us not without risk, right? So we had people that were kicked out of their homes. They were abandoned by the religious community and friends. One really stands out, a guy that we call Glenn, who was kicked out at the age of 14. He came out as gay, and his father rattled off the reference. I think it's Matthew 7:23 about depart from me, ye worker of iniquity. And he was literally homeless, right, as a teenager for a while. Right now, that's the extreme end. We deal with kind of a handful of people that came from really hardline and fundamentalist backgrounds. But the safety thing, right, that's going to be less applicable to most religious exiters, right? But it does strike me that actually is important. That's that first thing Ryan mentioned, and I think I agree there.
I love it. All right, Jesse, there was one thing you wanted to make sure we mentioned before we closed out. Do y'all want to have it?
Oh, well,
or either of you final things you want to make sure we cover?
Ryan, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about any of I know we're past the 2-hour mark here, but our list of 10 concerns, were there any of those that you wanted to maybe cover, or we can kind of leave that as a teaser for, encourage people to go buy the book. We outlined 10, we address rather the 10 top concerns that we've identified just in the literature and in the culture at large, about what religious exiting, what all this might mean for society at large, right? Will people become less charitable? Will they, have less meaning in their lives? Will they, not engage in civic activity as much? We go through a whole bunch of them, which obviously we're not going to do here, but I didn't know if there's anything, Ryan, you wanted to say just kind of generally about that, and then people can read on their own.
No, I think it's good, right? So that is our last chapter. It was very much intended to capture the last part of the subtitle, which is the causes. We've talked a lot about the causes for people leaving and the consequences. And that last chapter really wrestles pretty carefully with the consequences using solid empirical data, qualitative and quantitative. And I love it. That's probably my favorite chapter in the book. And I hope a lot of readers will actually pick it up for that reason. It's a great, solid last chapter.
So that's the teaser.
Yes.
And if I'm going to just give a spoiler, don't worry. How's that?
That's a really good summary, John.
They will have fewer children. That's true. But all the other things we go through, there might be some counterintuitive findings there for some people.
Okay. I love that. A spoiler. Really quickly, I should have asked this earlier. Are y'all noticing any resurgence in religion? Obviously, with Donald Trump and kind of Republican success in 2024, and with the rise of like J.D. Vance, who is well known to have recently converted to Catholicism, are y'all noticing a resurgence of interest in religiosity, specifically amongst conservative Republicans and or Trump Vance supporters? I'm just curious if you're seeing that at all or not.
I can jump in a little bit. So as far as survey data goes, no, there's not, like, we haven't seen a reversal in the percentage who say they're unaffiliated, the nuns. We haven't seen an uptick in people going to religious services. We haven't seen upticks in any of the belief measures. A lot of the belief measures have been holding steady, whereas the others have been declining. So at a broad survey level, we aren't seeing that. But there is one finding that is just now making it into the literature. I've seen it at a couple of conferences, and it's kind of weird, is that historically, it was kind of the other way around, that religiosity drove political affiliation. And now we're seeing an inversion of that people who are identifying as, say, Trump supporters or, conservative Republicans, now they're starting to say, well, I guess if I'm a Trump supporter and I'm conservative and I'm a Republican, I'm also an evangelical. And so it's been this weird inversion of the causal relationship, which causality is always tricky, right? But we're starting to see this weird kind of trend where some of these people are like, I don't actually go to church. I don't even believe in God, but I'm an evangelical now because that's what it means to be a Trump supporter. So I don't know that it's led to any meaningful uptick in religious identification at all, but we've seen a little bit of this happening, which is kind of strange.
Yeah, I would like to see, hopefully at some point there might be some quantitative data on that, but it is interesting. Kind of some of this stuff reminds me a little bit, with the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, right? And the increased interest among especially young men. This links up actually to the question of, loneliness and isolation and degradation of, intimate relationships and those kinds of things. But, the muscular Christianity movement of like the 19th century, right? That's focused on, all of those, traditional notions about, discipline and masculinity and commitment and, kind of like the 12 rules kind of thing. I don't doubt that some of that is definitely at play here. I think that some people are taking a renewed interest in religion. But as Ryan just suggested, it is kind of this strange new situation. It's this inversion of things, right? The reasons, the driving forces, the motivations for people taking a renewed interest in religion, I think might be very different than what they used to be. It might not necessarily be about, doctrinal or religious claims or things that are pushing people toward it. It's more of a kind of a cultural phenomena and which tribe do you belong to kind of thing. It's more complicated than that. Peterson's last book, I think, most recent book, I haven't read it. I think Those Who Struggle with God, I think is the name of it. I think that speaks a little bit to what we're talking about here, this kind of renewed interest. And I do think in some sense it is a gendered phenomena in some sense. I think it has to do with, men in particular in this country searching for meaning in their lives.
Love it. All right. Well, everyone, thanks for sticking with us to the end. The book is Goodbye Religion. The Causes and Consequences of Secularization, Dr. Ryan Cragun and Dr. Jesse Smith. I should have asked you this at the beginning. Why that title? Because, you know, if the Mormon church alone is worth $250 billion, it's not going anywhere ever. If, you know, if the Shakers or whatever can exist into 2024 prohibiting childbirth, you know, religion's not going anywhere. So why goodbye religion as the title?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of double entendres. So with this one, we have the individual saying goodbye to religion, right? So that's the first kind of major point, is like, I'm leaving, goodbye religion. And then of course the second interpretation of that is religion is going away, goodbye to religion. So you're absolutely right. We're not suggesting that religion is going to disappear anytime soon, but I do like double entendres. So if it's a terrible title, I get all of the blame. If it's a great title, Jesse let me go with it, and so Jesse gets part of the credit. How's that? Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's fine. And the publisher did ask us about some other titles too, that I rejected, I think, a little more roundly than Ryan did. But yeah, it has this kind of double meaning thing and we want to be, you know, slightly provocative, right? And
no, it's clickbait. So, you academics are not above clickbait, apparently.
No, we're not immune to that either. And I would say that
publishers are not. I respect a little well-selected clickbait now and again.
Yes, but no, neither of us, you know, expect religion to disappear entirely, if not now, ever. I mean,
yeah.
All right. Well, Ryan Cragun, Jesse Smith. So, Jesse, it's nice to have you on for the first time. Say hi to Heather. We're fans of Heather. Say hi to her.
Yeah.
Thanks
for having me.
Please come again. Ryan, it's always great to have you. I hope we have you on at least twice a year, if not more. And tell Rick he's a fetcher and he needs to get his butt on Mormon Stories.
Got it. Will do. Appreciate it, John. Thanks so much. This was lots of fun.
Thank you.
Happy New Year. Thanks again, guys. And again, I'll just do a final plug. Go buy this book. Make it an Amazon bestseller. Goodbye Religion, The Causes and Consequences of Secularization. I think if you're secular, you'll be pleasantly encouraged by this book. And if you're religious, maybe you'll figure out how to make your churches or your religions more hospitable, more compatible, so that people won't want to leave and so that people will have good experiences there. Please subscribe and like this channel. Please donate to make Mormon Stories possible. You go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, become a monthly donor. You can also subscribe on Spotify, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, Instagram. And we love your feedback at mormonstories@gmail.com. And we're grateful for everyone that makes this possible, including today. That would be Julia and Maven and Gerardo and Brooklyn and my board. Thanks to everyone who donates. We couldn't do it without you. You know, we're looking forward to an exciting 2025. So thanks to all our loyal listeners and viewers and everyone who made comments in the chats. We've got more coming up in the days, weeks, months, and ahead. So stay tuned on Mormon Stories. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. And we'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.